Hi, this is Paul. This is a little something different. I'm here in Chicago. We're going to have the meetup event tonight. And I really wanted to say more about Love's Executioner and some of what this story bears on the question of reality, of shared realities, and also of sort of the dead reckoning that is pursued in a secular frame. So Sam's going to pick me up in a few minutes, but why waste time? See if we can finish off this story. And again, yeah, spoilers. So don't listen if you want to read the story yourself and you want to know how it ends. Although I've read it a couple times now and I've enjoyed it and seen more in it each time I've been through it. So this is from the first story in Irvin Yalom's Love's Executioner, and this is the story of Thelma. And if you remember from my last video, Thelma came into Dr. Yalom. She had been in therapy for 20 years. She had suffered from depression. The reason that she had come to Dr. Yalom, she believed it was her last chance. If she didn't succeed with him, she was going to commit suicide. And she had an obsession, a love obsession with her former therapist that she had had an affair with. If you want more of the story, listen to the last video. And so finally, when therapy was stuck, Dr. Yalom invited Matthew in, and what he discovered was that the truth was very different from what he had supposed it would be.
Listen to Matthew, my head began to spin. I had developed a variety of hypotheses for his behavior, but I was not remotely prepared for the story I had just heard. First, was it true? Matthew was a charmer. He was smooth. Was he staging all this for me? No. I had no doubt that the things were as he described them. His words had the unmistakable ring of truth. He freely offered the names of hospitals and his treating physicians if I should want to call. Furthermore, Thelma, to whom he said he had told this in the past, had listened with rapt attention and offered no demurral whatsoever. I turned to look at Thelma, but she averted her gaze. After Matthew finished talking, she began to stare out the window. Was it possible that she knew all this from the start and had concealed it from me? Or had she been so absorbed with her own distress and her own needs that throughout she had been completely unaware of Matthew's mental state? Or had she known for some brief period and then repressed the knowledge because it clashed with her own vital lie? Only Thelma could tell me. But which Thelma? The Thelma who deceived me? The Thelma who deceived herself? Or the Thelma who was deceived by herself? I doubted that I would find the answers to these questions.
Now this is where we get, in some ways, into the secret sacred self, because we all want to believe that we are one integrated whole self. The difficulty that we have is, from what perspective can you actually see this self? What perspective knows this self? I mean, do I know myself? There are aspects of me that my family knows that I don't know of myself. There are aspects of you that you know of me, even though you sort of have this little thin picture of me. But we're also always projecting on each other. We had a little Zoom conference, and Bern was on there, and Bern talked a little bit about the fact that one of the things that you learn very quickly with a YouTube channel is that people have ideas about who you are, but then when you listen to them presenting you to yourself, you think, no, that's not me. And the difficulty that Thelma has, and this will be pretty common in many of these stories and is true of many of us, where was this deceit coming from? Was Thelma deceiving herself? Probably to a degree. Was she deceiving the therapist? Probably to a degree. Did she even know she was deceiving the therapist? Perhaps. So there's all these different selves that are out there. And, well, then the question is, well, what is truth? What is the real self? And again, what we seem to have constructed or are constructing in our contemporary culture is this secret, sacred self that is supposedly the true self, but who has access to this true self? Now, as a Christian, I would say God does, but some might push back on me and say, well, that's kind of an easy answer. Is God talking? Is he telling us who our self is? Will he reveal it to us? And in this case here, the therapist is trying to work with Thelma to not only integrate all of these aspects of herself, but to heal. But what exactly does healing look like? Is she better off with this love obsession, or as He is, in this story, Love's executioner. He's going to destroy Love in order that she can have an encounter with the truth. Oh, my sound is up a little high. This is, as you can see, I'm not in my little office where I've got my studio, and so I don't have my settings all in, but it's kind of fun to set all this up on the road and see how it goes. Now let's keep going.
Primarily, though, my attention was fixed on Matthew. Over the last several months, I had constructed a vision, or rather several alternative visions, of him. An irresponsible sociopathic Matthew who exploited his patients. A callous and sexually confused Matthew who acted out his personal conflicts with women in general or mother in particular. An errant, grandiose young therapist who mistook the love desired for the love required. And yet,
and again, all of these Matthews in his mind.
He was none of these. He was something else. Something I had never anticipated, but what, I wasn't certain. A well-intentioned victim? A wounded healer? A Christ figure who had sacrificed his own integrity for Thelma? Certainly, I no longer viewed him as an offending therapist. He was as much a patient as Thelma, and furthermore, I could not help thinking, glancing toward Thelma, who was still staring out the window, a working patient, a patient after my own heart. I remember feeling dislocated. So many constructs exploded in so few minutes. Gone forever was the construct of Matthew as a sociopath or exploiter therapist. Instead, there arose a haunting question. In this relationship, who had exploited whom? This was all the information I could handle, and all that I thought I needed. I have only a dim recollection of the rest of the hour. I remember that Matthew encouraged Thelma to ask more questions. It was as though he, too, sensed that she could be released only by information, that her illusions could not endure the beam of truth.
Okay, and so again, he, as the doctor, is there to take away, to dispel these illusions from her.
And I think, too, that he realized that only through Thelma's release could he obtain his own. I remember that Thelma and I both asked many questions, each of which he answered fully. His wife had left him 4 years ago. She and he had increasingly diverging views about religion, and she could not follow his conversion into a fundamentalist Christian sect. No, he was not gay, nor had he ever been, though Thelma had often asked him about that. It was only at this moment that his smile narrowed and a trace of irritation entered his voice. I kept telling you, Thelma, that straight people live in the hate, too. No, he had never had a personal relationship with any other patient. In fact, as a result of his psychosis and what had happened with Thelma, he had, several years ago, realized that his psychological problems posed an insurmountable barrier, and he had stopped being a therapist. But, committed to a life of service, he did psychological testing for a few years. Then he worked in a biofeedback lab, and more recently, he had become the administrator of a Christian health maintenance organization. I was musing about Matthew's professional decision, even wondering whether he had evolved to the point where he should go back to doing therapy. Perhaps he now might make an excellent therapist, when I noticed that her time was almost up. I inquired whether we had covered everything. I asked Thelma to project herself into the future and to imagine how she might feel several hours from now. Would she be left with unasked questions? To my surprise, she began sobbing so forcefully that she could not catch her breath. Tears poured down her new blue dress until Matthew, outracing me, handed her the box of tissues. As her sobbing subsided, Thelma's words grew audible. I simply can't believe that Matthew really cares about what happens to me. Her words were directed neither to Matthew nor to me, but to some point between us in the room. I noted with some satisfaction that I wasn't the only one she addressed in the third person. I tried to help Thelma talk. Why? Why didn't you believe him? He's saying that because he has to. It's the right thing to say. It's the only thing he can say. Matthew did his best, but communication...
And it's amazing how she's both trying to defend her image of the world, how that's going, and also still, even after Matthew has landed this on her, trying to defend him.
Was difficult because of her sobbing. I mean exactly what I've said. I've thought about you every day these 8 years. I care about what happens to you. I care about you a great deal. And you're caring? What does it mean? I know about your caring. You care about the poor, about ants and plants and ecological systems. I don't want to be one of your ants. We had run 20 minutes over and had to stop even though Thelma was still not regaining her composure. I gave her an appointment for the following day, not only to be supportive, but also because it would be best to see her again quickly, while the details of this hour were still fresh in her mind. The three of us ended the hour with round-robin handshakes and parted. A few minutes later, as I was getting some coffee, I noticed Thelma and Matthew chatting in the corridor. He was trying to make a point to her, but she was looking away from him. Shortly afterward, I saw them walk away in different directions. Thelma had not recovered by the next day and was exceptionally labial throughout our session. She wept often and at times flashed into anger. First, she lamented that Matthew had such a low opinion of her. She had worked and worried Matthew's statement that he cared for her until it now seemed an insult. He had, she noted, mentioned none of her.
Notice in many ways how Matthew needs to become a different person in order for in order for Thelma to sort of maintain who she thinks she is.
Positive features, and Thelma convinced herself that his basic posture to her had been unfriendly. Furthermore, she was convinced that probably because of my presence, he had adopted a pseudo-therapeutic voice and manner which she found patronizing. Thelma rambled a great deal and swerved back and forth between her reconstruction of the hour and her reaction to it. I feel like an amputation has taken place. Something is gone from me. Despite Matthew's high-sounding ethics, I believe I am more honest than he, especially in his account of who seduced who. Thelma remained cryptic on this matter, and I did not press her for explanation. Although I would have relished finding out what really happened, her reference to amputation intrigued me even more. I haven't had any more fantasies about Matthew, she went on. I'm not daydreaming anymore, but I want to. I want to sink into the embrace of some warm daydream. It's cold out, and I feel empty. Now there is just...
Notice how this for her was something she needed, something she had constructed. This was a defense against something. This was, in other words, she had to create a self around this.
Nothing. Like a drifting boat torn loose from its mooring, I thought. But a sentient boat desperately searching for a berth, any berth. Now, between obsessions, Thelma was in a rare free-floating state. This was the time I had been waiting for. Such states don't last long. The unbonded obsessional, like nascent oxygen, quickly melds with some mental image or idea. This moment, this brief interval between obsessions, was the crucial time for us to work, before Thelma re-established her equilibrium by latching onto something or someone. Most likely, she would reconstruct the hour with Matthew so that her version of reality would once again support her fusion fantasy. It seemed to me that real progress had occurred. The surgery was complete, and now my task was to prevent her from preserving the amputated limb.
Now, it's helpful to remember that, part of what the scientific image tries to do is keep everything on the lower register, imagining that on the lower register, that's where somehow we can finally firmly establish truth. But you see here, everything here is going on in the upper register. It's not on the lower register. The basic statement of events is not in question. The interpretation of the events and the minds of all the people, that's where everything's happening.
And quickly stitching it back on again. My opportunity arrived soon, as Thelma proceeded to lament her loss. My predictions of what might happen have come true. I don't have any more hope. I'll never have any more satisfaction. I could live with that 1% chance. I lived with it for a long time. What was the satisfaction, Thelma? A 1% chance for what? For what? For those 27 days. Until yesterday, there was always a chance that Matthew and I could go back to that time. We were there. The feeling was real. I know love when I feel it. As long as
I know love when I feel it. Again, it's in that way, she's really constructed her own little secret sacred self, and it's all self-authenticating. It's this cult of authenticity. I know love when I feel it. But now he's going to lean in and finish the job.
Matthew and I were alive. We always had the chance to return to it. Until yesterday, in your office. There were still a few threads of illusion to be severed. I'd almost totally destroyed the obsession. It was time to finish the job. Thelma, what I have to say now is not pleasant, but I think it's important. Let me try to get my thoughts out clearly. If two people share a moment or share a feeling between them, if they both feel the same thing, then I can see how it might be possible for them, as long as they're alive, to reestablish that precious feeling between the two of them.
Okay, so what he's using here is sort of an interpersonal test of verification. I feel this, you feel this. Okay. But what exactly do I feel, and what exactly do you feel? And all of those feelings are themselves attached to matrices that go all the way down. And you have this when you fall in love. You have this in any interpersonal relationship. Two people might say, oh, yes, I'm feeling it. But do the feelings actually connect?
It would be a delicate procedure. After all, people change and love never stays. But still, perhaps, it is within the realm of possibility. They could communicate fully. They could try to achieve a deep, authentic relationship, which, since authentic love is an absolute state, should approximate what they had had before. But suppose it was never a shared experience. Suppose that...
shared experience. It's a shared experience, but can experiences actually be shared? I mean, these are a lot of the questions he pursues in a lot of these stories in this book.
The two people had widely different experiences, and suppose one of them mistakenly thought her experience was the same as his. Thelma's eyes were fixed on me. I was certain.
Now the way that they're testing these experiences will all be language. You know, we're just sort of testing one another with respect to I'm using this language, you're using that language within a similar cultural frame, therefore it must be the same. Part of what you learn, let's say being married for a very long time, depending whether you think my 34 years of marriage is a very long time, it's a significant amount of time, is when you go back and talk about where you were when you first fell in love, where you were when you married. All of these things change. Luce Meads once made the comment that he said, "My wife has been married to 4 different people, and they're all me," and that's very true. And he'd been married to different women as well, and they're all her.
And that she understood me perfectly. I continued. What I heard in the session with Matthew was precisely that. His experience and your experience were very different. Can you see how impossible it would be for each of you to recreate the particular mental state you were in? The two of you can't help one another with this.
And even now the goal, because to a certain degree within the secular frame, what you've really got to work with is the goal, the mental state. That's a pretty tenuous thing.
This because it was not a shared state. He was in one place and you were in another. He was lost in a psychosis. He didn't know where his boundaries were, where he ended and you began. He wanted you to be happy because he thought he was the same as you. He wasn't having a love experience because he didn't know who he was. Your experience was very different. You cannot recreate a state of shared romantic love, of the two of you being deeply in love with one another, because it was never there in the first place.
And this is a serious blow to the reality of the secret sacred self, the self-authenticating that. Well, I feel it, it's authentic to me. But what does it mean?
I don't think I've ever said a crueler thing, but to make myself heard, I had to speak in words so strong and so stark that they could be neither twisted nor forgotten. There was no doubt my comment struck home. Thelma had stopped crying and just sat there, stock still, considering my words. I broke the heavy silence after several minutes. How do you feel about what I said, Thelma? I can't feel anything anymore. There's nothing else to feel. I have to find a way to live out my time. I feel numb. You've been living and feeling one way for 8 years, and now suddenly, in 24 hours, all that is pulled away from you. These next few days are going to feel very disorienting. You're going to feel lost, but we have to expect that. How could it be otherwise? I said this because often the best way to prevent a calamitous reaction is to predict it. Another way is to help the patient get outside of it and move into the observer role. So I added, it will be important this week to be an observer and recorder of your own inner state. I'd like you to check in on your internal state every 4 hours
A little practice of self-transcendence.
when you're awake, and jot down your observations. We'll go over them next week. But the next week, Thelma, for the first time, missed her appointment. Her husband called to apologize for his wife, who had overslept, and we agreed upon a meeting 2 days later. When I went to the waiting room to greet Thelma, I was dismayed at her physical deterioration. She was back in her green jogging suit and had obviously not combed her hair or made any other attempts to groom herself. Moreover, for the first time, she was accompanied by her husband, Harry, a tall, white-haired man with a large bulbous nose, who sat there squeezing a grip strengthener in each hand. I remember Thelma's telling me about his teaching hand-to-hand combat in wartime. I could picture him strangling someone.
Now some of the shockers start to come in this story.
I thought it was odd that he accompanied her that day. In spite of her age, Thelma is physically fit and had always driven herself to my office. My curiosity was piqued even more by her comment in the waiting room that Harry wanted to meet with me today. I had met him once before. In the 3rd or 4th session, I saw him together with Thelma for a 15-minute discussion, primarily to see what kind of person he was and to learn about the marriage from his perspective. Never before had he asked to meet with me. Obviously, something important was up. I agreed to speak to him for the last 10 minutes of Thelma's hour, and also made it clear that I would feel free to report back to her the entirety of our discussion. Thelma looked weary. She slumped into her chair and spoke slowly and softly in a resigned tone. My week has been a horror. Sheer hell. My obsession is gone, or almost gone, I guess.
Okay, so here's the question. Well-being. You're navigating by dead reckoning within the secular frame, and so it's well-being. Well, now she says, this week was hell. Well, the doctor has to make a decision. Is this a therapeutic suffering in order to achieve a better good at the other end? what kind of dead reckoning is this? I was going to set up my tablet and figure out how to do my little whiteboard thing, but I haven't figured that out here in the hotel yet. But I think part of what religions do is really try to navigate, this is a fairly obvious statement, but beyond the secular frame. And so basically the secularist is bookended by birth and death, and trying to, in one way, figure out how to navigate towards well-being within birth and death. That's in some ways sort of Sam Harris's frame. Well, this is well-being. What religious frames do, obviously, is explode that, because you're also trying to navigate things beyond the grave. Now, this can get distorted, because if you're not navigating, it's enormously complicated. There are goods beyond the grave that you want to sacrifice for in this frame. It's very common in religious experiences, and there's going to be distortions if you say, well, we're just going to have my best life now within the frame. And people don't like it when I say, well, you can have your cocaine high and your bullet chaser. Well, you just make the frame really tiny and you maximize the amount of pleasure. But again, that doesn't work, and we don't believe it, because we say, no, that's not meaningful. And so this meaning crisis very much hits on this religious frame. And so was the doctor justified in destroying the obsession if the obsession worked for her? True or untrue, good or bad? And you find Yalom making these kinds of decisions because at certain points in the book he talks about the fact that, well, there's this denial of death that people have with religious ideas. And we all know that these ideas are unfounded, but if they help people cope in this world, then they're justifiable. But what about her obsession? What about her illusion? Is an illusion warranted or validated by the fact that it's helping it work for them? Well, it wasn't working for her because she had been depressed and she had been suicidal. Okay, so anything that threatens the end frame therefore must be dealt with. But from this point on, it looks like she's at least as suicidal as she was before.
Yes. Rather than 90% of the time, I spend less than 20% of my waking time thinking about Matthew. And even that 20% is different. But what have I been doing instead? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I've been sleeping 12 hours a day. All I do is sleep and sit and sigh. I'm
classic depression.
Almost dried up. I can't cry anymore. Harry, who is almost never critical of me, said to me last night as I picked up my dinner, I've hardly eaten anything this week. Are you feeling sorry for yourself again? How do you explain what's happening to you? It's like I've been in a magic show and now I've come outside and it's very gray outside.
Is the illusory world better? Again, if you go back to Matrix, you have Cypher, and there's this scene where Cypher is eating the steak and he's talking to Mr. Anderson. He says, I know this steak is just little bits, but I want to be put back in the Matrix, not eat that gruel on the Nebuchadnezzar, and I want to be rich, and I want to be famous, and, oh, yes, we'll do all that for it. No, Cypher never gets what is promised to him.
I felt goosebumps. I had never before heard Thelma speak metaphorically. It was as though someone else were speaking. Say some more about how you feel. I feel old, really old. For the first time, I know I'm 70 years old, 70. That's older than 99% of the people walking around. I feel like a zombie, run out of gas. My life's a void, a dead end. Nothing to do but live out my time.
So this is the cure?
These words were said quickly, but the cadence slowed for the last sentence. Then she turned to me and fixed her eyes on mine. That in itself was unusual, for she had seldom ever looked directly at me. Maybe I was wrong, but I think her eyes said, "Are you satisfied now?" I did not comment on her gaze.
Are you satisfied now, doctor? You have ripped the illusion from my life, and now I am at least as depressed as I was before. Before I at least had hope. Maybe it wasn't a rationally founded hope, but at least I had hope that somehow me and Matthew would somehow be together, etc., etc.
All of this followed our session with Matthew. What happened in that hour to throw you like this? What a fool I was to have protected him for 8 years. Thelma's anger enlivened her. She took her string purse from her lap, placed it on the floor, and put a lot of energy into her words. What reward did I get? I'll tell you, a kick in the teeth. If I hadn't kept his secret from my therapist all these years, maybe the dominoes might have fallen differently. I don't understand. What was the kick in your teeth? You were there. You saw it. You saw his callousness. He didn't say hello or goodbye to me. He didn't answer my questions. How much?
Now remember, the doctor's impression of Matthew was he was he's a charming guy. The doctor left the meeting liking him. Now she, who had a love obsession with him, now hates him.
Effort would it have taken him? He still hasn't told me why he cut me off. I tried to describe to her how I had seen things differently and how, in my view, Matthew had been warm to her and had gone into lengthy and painful detail about why he had broken off with her. But Thelma rushed on, not listening to my comments. He was clear about only one thing. Matthew Jennings is sick and tired of Thelma Hilton. You tell me, what's the perfect scenario to drive an ex-lover to suicide? Sudden dismissal with no reasons given. That's exactly what he's done to me.
20 years of therapy has made Thelma an expert in the nomenclature.
One of my daydreams yesterday, I could see Matthew 8 years ago bragging to one of his friends and placing a bet on it, that he could use his psychiatric knowledge to first reduce me and then totally destroy me in 27 days.
Which, of course, is nothing at all like the story that Matthew told us.
Thelma leaned over, opened her purse, and pulled out a newspaper clipping about murder. She waited a couple of minutes for me to read it. She had underlined with red pencil a paragraph that claimed that suicides are, in actuality, double homicides. I saw that in last Sunday's paper. Could that have been true for me? Maybe when I tried to commit suicide, I really wanted to kill Matthew. You know, it feels right. Right here, she pointed to her heart.
Tried to kill the Matthew that was inside of her.
I never thought of it that way before. I fought to keep my equilibrium. Naturally, I was concerned about her depression, and yet, of course, she was in despair. How could it be otherwise? Only the deepest despair could have generated an illusion with the strength and the tenacity to have endured for 8 years. And if I eradicated the illusion, then I had to be prepared to encounter the despair it had concealed. So, bad as it was, Thelma's distress was a good sign, a homing signal that we were on target. Everything was going well. The preparation was finally complete, and the real therapy could now begin.
Just let that sink in. A couple more twists coming.
In fact, it had already begun. Thelma's surprising outbursts, her sudden eruption of anger toward Matthew, was a sign that the old defenses were no longer holding. She was in a fluid state. Every severely obsessional patient has a core of anger, and I was not unprepared for its emergence in Thelma. All in all, I considered her anger, despite its irrational components, an excellent development. I was so preoccupied with these thoughts and with plans for our future work that I missed the first part of Thelma's next comment, but I heard the ending of the sentence all too clearly. And that's why I have to stop therapy.
The fact that he missed the first part but caught the second part, again, is a note to the fact that he, the therapist, is also, now the real therapy can begin. Now we finally arrive. Now the good doctor can finally bring shalom, can finally bring well-being. Now the good doctor can finally, in some ways, play the creator God and once more restore this woman to health. But then that's why we have to stop therapy. What?
I scrambled to respond. Thelma, how can you even consider that? This is the worst possible time to stop therapy. Now is the time you can make some real progress. I don't want to be in therapy anymore. I've been a patient for 20 years. I'm tired of being treated like a patient. Matthew treated me like a patient, not a friend. You treat me like a patient. I want to be treated like everyone else. I no longer remember the sequence of my words. I only know that I pulled out all the stops and placed the utmost pressure on her to reconsider. I reminded her of the 6-month commitment, of which
now who's using power?
5 weeks remained. But she countered, even you would agree that there's a time when you have to protect yourself. A little more of this treatment would be unendurable, she added with a grim smile. A little more treatment would kill the patient.
Okay, she has to protect herself. But which self is she trying to protect?
All of my arguments met a similar fate. I insisted that we had made real progress. I reminded her that she had originally come to see me to free her mind from her preoccupation, and we had made great strides toward that. Now was the time we could address the underlying sense of emptiness and futility that had fueled the obsession. Her response was, in effect, that her losses had been too great, more than she could bear. She had lost her hope for the future. By that she meant she had lost her 1% chance of reconciliation. She had also lost the best 27 years of her life. If, as I had shown her, they weren't real, then she had lost this sustaining memory of her life's highest point.
Okay, so again, the real. Well, where is the real? How do we know the real? Is it better to have an image, to have hope, to have blessedness, even if the blessedness is a lie?
And she had also lost 8 years of sacrifice. If she had been protecting an illusion, then her sacrifice had been meaningless. So powerful were Thelma's words that I found no effective way to counter them, other than to acknowledge her losses and say that there was much mourning that she had to do, and that I wanted to be with her to help her mourn. I tried also to point out that regret was extraordinarily painful to endure once it was in place, and that we could do much to prevent further regret from taking root. For example, consider the decision facing her at this moment. Would she not, a month, a year from now, deeply regret her decision to stop treatment? Thelma replied that, though I was probably right, she had made a promise to herself to stop therapy. She compared our three-way session to a visit with the doctor when you suspect you have cancer. You've been in great turmoil, so frightened that you've put this visit off time and again. The doctor confirms that you do have cancer, and all your turmoil around not knowing is ended. But
Now pay attention. Even the illustration has to do with the secular frame of the bookends of life.
what are you left with? As I tried to sort out my feelings, I realized that one of my first responses clamoring for attention was, "How can you do this to me?" Though no doubt my outrage derived in part from my own frustration, I was also certain I was responding to Thelma's feelings toward me. I was the person responsible for all three losses. The three-way meeting had been my idea, and I had been the one who stripped her of her illusions. I was the disillusioner. It occurred to me that I was performing a thankless task. Even the word disillusion, with its negative nihilistic connotation, should have warned me.
Now, a thankless task, at this point, he's still framing it as, well, I am still the truth bringer. I am still the healer. I am still the one that, well, if she's suffering from a delusion, I myself should stand up and demonstrate to dispel the illusion. Truth at any cost. That's what this is about, right? The search for truth.
I thought of O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh and the fate of Hickey, the disillusioner. Those whom he tries to restore to reality ultimately turn against him and re-enter the life of illusion. I remember my discovery a few weeks before that Thelma knew how to punish and didn't need my help. I think her suicide try was a murder attempt, and now believe that her decision to stop therapy was also a form of double homicide. She considered termination to be an attack upon me, and she was right. She had perceived how critically important it was to me to succeed, to satisfy my intellectual curiosity, to follow everything through until the very end.
One of the things I like about Yalom is that he does not maintain sort of himself up at the heights of this monarchical vision, but he comes down into it, and because he is also in the room. He is not the doctor that sees all and knows all and is the hand of God that can somehow work in her life.
Her revenge upon me was to frustrate each of these aims, no matter that the cataclysm she meant for me would engulf her as well. In fact, her sadomasochistic trends were so pronounced that she was attracted by the idea of dual immolation. I noted wryly that my resorting to professional diagnostic jargon meant I must really be angry with her.
So he's discovering his own self that he can't feel.
I tried to explore these ideas with Thelma. I hear your anger toward Matthew, but I'm also wondering if you're not upset with me too. It would make a lot of sense if you were angry, very angry indeed, with me. After all, in some ways, you must feel that I got you into the fix you are in now. It was my idea to invite Matthew, my idea to ask the questions you did. I thought I saw her nod her head. If that's so, Thelma, what better place to work on it than right here and now in therapy? Thelma nodded her head more vigorously. My head tells me that you're right, but sometimes you've got to do what you've got to do. I promised myself not to be a patient anymore, and I'm going to keep that promise.
Not to be a patient anymore. Again, trying to evaluate this, one could look at this and say, well, this is an evaluation. This is a step of agency moving forward. Isn't being a patient towards the outcome of no longer being a patient?
I gave up. I was facing a stone wall. Our hour was long over, and I had yet to see Harry, to whom I had promised 10 minutes. Before parting, I extracted some commitments from Thelma. She agreed to think more about her decision and to meet with me again in 3 weeks. And she promised to honor her commitment to the research project by meeting 6 months hence with a research psychologist and completing the battery of questionnaires. I ended the session thinking that, though she might fulfill her research commitment, there was little chance she would resume therapy. Her Pyrrhic victory safely in her grasp, she could afford a little generosity, and as she was leaving my office, she thanked me for my efforts and said that if she ever went back into therapy, I would be her first choice as a therapist. I escorted Thelma to the waiting room and Harry to my office.
And now another shoe drops.
He was brisk and direct. I know what it is to run a tight ship, Doc. I did it in the Army for 30 years. And I see that you're running late. That means you'll be running late all day, doesn't it? I nodded, but assured him that I had time to meet with him. Well, I can keep it very brief. I'm not like Thelma. I never beat around the bush. I'll come right to the point. Give me back my wife, Doctor. The old Thelma. Just the way she used to be.
So, in other words, the illusion worked not only for Thelma, but for her husband. And again, earlier in the chapter, there's descriptions about what their marriage had been like, and certainly not ideal, but good enough for Harry and good enough for Thelma.
Harry's voice was pleading rather than threatening. Just the same, he had my full attention. And as he spoke, I could not help glancing at his large strangler's hands. He proceeded, and now reproach entered his voice, to describe how Thelma had gotten progressively worse since she and I had started working together. After hearing him out, I tried to offer some support by stating that a long depression is almost as hard on the family as it is on the patient. Ignoring my gambit, he responded that Thelma had always been a good wife and that perhaps he had aggravated her problem by being on the go and traveling too much. Finally, when I informed him of Thelma's decision to terminate, he seemed relieved and gratified. He had been urging her in this direction for several weeks. After Harry left my office, I sat there tired and stunned and angry. God, what a couple! Deliver me from both of them. The irony of it all.
Now, suddenly, the observer is the judge.
The old fool wants his old Thelma back. Has he been so absent he hasn't noticed that he never had the old Thelma? The old Thelma was never home. For the last 8 years, she had spent 90% of her life lost in the fantasy of a love she never had. Harry, no less than Thelma, choose to embrace illusion. Cervantes asked, "Which will you have, wise madness or foolish sanity?" It was clear which choice Harry and Thelma were making. But I got little solace from pointing my finger at Thelma and Harry, or from lamenting the weakness of the human spirit, that feeble wraith unable to survive without illusion, without enchantment,
And again, this is his perspective. He's an existentialist.
or pipe dreams, or vital lies. It was time to face the truth. I had botched this case beyond belief.
And when I listened to that the first time, I thought, huh? Wasn't it your job to bring in the truth, disavow her of the illusion? On what metric have you botched it? Must be the metric that, well, he has to bring her to well-being. And if the treatment is so dramatic and so painful that the patient stops treatment, then in fact you lose the patient. He botched the case.
And I could not transfer blame to the patient or her husband or the human condition. My next few days were filled with self-recrimination and worry about Thelma. At first concerned about suicide, I ultimately soothed myself with the thought that her anger was so overt and so outwardly directed that it was unlikely she would turn it against herself. To combat my self-recriminations, I attempted to persuade myself that I had employed a proper therapeutic strategy. Thelma was in extremis when she consulted me, and something had to be done. Although she was in bad shape now, she was no worse than when she started. Who knows?
She had, of course, I don't know if I mentioned this, she had attempted suicide, and that sort of put Harry, that energized the people around them, as usually a suicide attempt will do. And then suddenly, well, we've got to get Thelma fixed, and so send her to the doctors.
Maybe she was better. Maybe I had successfully disillusioned her, and she needed to lick her wounds in solitude for a while before proceeding with another form of therapy. I had tried a more conservative approach for 4 months and had resorted to a radical intervention only when it was apparent I had no other choice. But this was all self-deception. I knew that I had good reason to be guilty. I had once again fallen prey to the grandiose belief that I can treat anyone. Swept along by hubris and my curiosity, I had disregarded 20 years of evidence at the outset that Thelma was a poor candidate for psychotherapy.
Okay, but again, she had attempted suicide. She was suicidal. What therapy did you have for her? What therapy would the family want for her? I mean, I'm not offering any answers here. These are the kinds of tough questions that I see in people's lives all the time.
And had subjected her to a painful confrontation which, in retrospect, had little likelihood of success. I had stripped away defenses without building anything to replace them. Perhaps Thelma was right in protecting herself from me at this point. Perhaps she was right in saying that a little more treatment would kill the patient. All in all, I deserved Thelma and Harry's criticism. I had also embarrassed myself professionally. In describing her psychotherapy at a teaching conference a couple of weeks before, I had aroused considerable interest. I cringed now at the prospect of colleagues and students asking me in the weeks to come.
Part of what I really like about his book is this honesty. But again, part of the part of the whole part of the wormhole of psychology is that you just go down, and is it honesty, or is this performative for the people who are reading him and honoring him, and these things just go down and down and down.
Fill us in. How did it all turn out? As I had expected, Thelma did not keep her next appointment 3 weeks later. I phoned her and had a brief but remarkable conversation. Though she was adamant in reaffirming her intention to quit the realm of patienthood, I detected less rancor in her voice. Not only was she turned off therapy, she volunteered, but she had no further need of it. She had been feeling much better, certainly far better than 3 weeks ago.
Oh, so maybe, in fact, the good doctor cured her.
Seeing Matthew yesterday, she told me offhandedly, had helped immeasurably. What? Matthew? How did that come about? I asked. Oh, I had a pleasant talk with him over coffee. We've agreed to meet for a chat every month or so. I was in a frenzy of curiosity and questioned her closely. First, she responded in a teasing way.
This story does not surprise me at all. People find ways in their illusions, through their illusions, despite their people find ways.
I told you all along, that's what I needed. Then she simply made it clear that I no longer had the right to make personal inquiries. Eventually, I realized I would learn no more and said my final goodbye. I went through the ritual of telling her that I was available as a therapist should she ever change her mind, but she apparently never again developed an appetite for my type of treatment, and I did not hear from her again. 6 months later, the research team interviewed Thelma and re-administered the battery of psychological instruments. When the final research report was issued, I turned quickly to their review of the case of Thelma Hilton. In summary, T.H. is a 70-year-old married Caucasian woman who, as a result of a 5-month, once-weekly course of therapy, improved significantly. In fact,
and of course, this is what's written up in the books.
Of the 28 geriatric subjects involved in this study, she had the most positive outcome. She is significantly less depressed. Her suicidality, extremely high at the onset, was reduced to the point where she may no longer be considered a suicidal risk. Self-esteem improved, and there was corresponding significant improvement on several other scales: anxiety, hypochondriacal, psychoticism, and obsessionalism. The research team is not entirely clear about the nature of the therapy which produced these impressive results, because the patient continues to be unaccountably secretive about the details of therapy. It appears that the therapist successfully employed a pragmatic symptom-oriented treatment plan designed to offer relief rather than deep insight or personality change. In addition, he effectively employed a systems approach and introduced into the therapy process both her husband and a lifelong friend, from whom she had been long estranged. Heady stuff. Somehow, it afforded me little comfort.
Just genius. And what I love about this book is it just rings true of people. How we are. Well, she got her Matthew back. It took a rather circuitous route, and her husband is happy now that she has her once a month conversation with Matthew. Not therapy now, just friends meeting. The husband will never know that they have those 28 days, and never know that they had that conjugal visit, as it were. And so who is the self? What is a man? What is a woman? Who are we? Can we know the truth? Can we know ourselves? Is a human being sufficient to actually know themselves or another? So, had to finish the story. The story was just too good. So, yeah, pick up the book. There's lots of good stories in the book. Oops.